subtle trends as a carbon source and sink and its impacts on the future global climates. In order to understand the impacts of climate change on the Arctic, it's important to understand what exactly makes up the Arctic. As shown in the figure above, the Arctic is usually defined as anywhere above the latitude of 66.5 degrees north of the equator, but it can vary depending on the definition. There are 8 countries within the Arctic boundaries: Canada, USA, Norway, Sweden, Russia, Greenland, Finland, and Iceland. So before getting started, here are some important definitions. A carbon source is a region that releases carbon in some form, such as carbon dioxide or methane, into an ecosystem or environment. A carbon sink is the opposite of carbon source. It is a region which can uptake more carbon than is released and generally stores it in a non-gas form. Carbon emissions are generally the base rates which scientists study when determining if a region is a carbon source or sink. With this information, one is able to more accurately understand what kind of carbon molecules are released and at what overall rate. The Arctic is currently acting as a carbon sink, but it may vary region by region. It is also expected to shift to a carbon source sometime in the near future for various reasons, which will be discussed shortly. Over the next 80 years, it is expected that the Arctic will warm more than any other part of the planet, with an overall temperature increase from anywhere between 2 to 9 degrees Celsius, depending on which climate model is used. This increase in temperature will have an impact on everything from snow cover to soil, vegetation, sea ice, and even the Arctic Ocean itself. As you all probably already know, albedo is the reflectivity of a surface. Surfaces with greater snow cover will reflect more incoming solar radiation than darker surfaces. Losing snow cover will greatly affect the albedo of the Arctic. On terrestrial surfaces, the loss of snow cover will allow for more vegetation growth, further contributing to the decrease in albedo. In marine environments, loss of sea ice will have the same effect, only the Arctic Ocean will be forced to absorb more solar radiation.
When considering carbon in the Arctic, one of the biggest indicators can be soil, which is capable of storing more than twice as much carbon as the atmosphere, causing it to be an important carbon sink. Soils below 10 degrees Celsius are better at holding carbon and can therefore be considered carbon sinks. Additionally, drier soils are better at storing carbon than damp soils because damp soils allow for permafrost to thaw faster. Increasing global temperatures causes the soils to warm as well as the snow cover to melt. This in turn decreases the insulation given by the snow and increasing its dampness. As a result, more carbon-containing gases are released into the atmosphere. The Arctic permafrost is one of the most important carbon sinks in the world and has a huge potential to be a massive source of carbon emissions. Permafrost is part of the ground that remains frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. When permafrost thaws, so does bacteria and the organic matter which it contains. The bacteria feeds on the organic matter and releases carbon dioxide, methane, and other carbon greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Over the past few years, permafrost has released 1.7 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere, which, just to put into perspective, is about 3 times the amount of carbon emitted by fossil fuels and cement production in Canada in just 2019. Microbial decomposition is the process by which organic carbon is broken down by fungi or bacteria. This process results in carbon gas emission, generally carbon dioxide, as well as mineral nutrients that the decomposers use. Decomposers work much faster at higher temperatures. Climate change has caused the period for decomposition to be extended. While the winter generally is too cold for these organisms to operate, in more southern areas of the Arctic where temperatures are higher and with insulation of the snow cover, it has been found that decomposers are still active past the growing season. This decomposition is key to the mass release of carbon found in the Arctic permafrost. During the summer seasons, vegetation is able to grow and uptake carbon through photosynthesis. The vegetation in the Arctic hasn't been able to keep up with the growing output of carbon from the permafrost thaw, which is resulting in a net production of carbon in the region. With the increased temperature, plants will, however, be able to expand their range further north and hopefully absorb more carbon with the increased biomass. Unfortunately, more vegetation brings the potential of wildfires and the lowering of surface albedo, which are factors capable of contributing to the growing carbon outputs.
The Arctic Ocean is one of our largest and most successful carbon sinks on the planet. This is just generally due to how temperature affects solubilities of gases. As the colder the waters are, the more gas it is able to uptake. This also means that it is able to uptake much more CO2 than other oceans and at a much quicker rate. This unfortunately results in ocean acidification much sooner and will also impact the plants and animals living in its ecosystems. With the Arctic's general dependence on cold waters for uptaking carbon emissions, one would assume that climate change may play a part in this in the future. Fortunately enough, it seems like climate change won't be changing the Arctic Ocean's temperature too drastically in the near future, therefore meaning that it probably won't switch from a carbon sink to a carbon source, at least maybe not until further in the future. So looking at our sources, in the first study by Cahoon and his team in 2012, they looked to see how microbial decomposition affected the overall ecosystem respiration of these regions. So ecosystem respiration is the rate at which all living organisms respire in this area, and it was used in this study as a way to calculate the overall carbon exchange from the ecosystem to the surrounding environments. So they found that air and soil temperatures had a significant correlation with the overall rate of which ecosystem respiration occurred. So they also looked to see the vegetation types on these sites. So as seen on the graph, along the x-axis you can see there are 4 different types of sites that each site was classified under. There was a combination of warm or cold soil as well as woody herbaceous sites. So dependent on the type of site, air and soil temperatures were recorded, as well as the overall ecosystem respiration resulting in CO2 release, the gross ecosystem photosynthesis resulting in CO2 uptake, and then the net ecosystem CO2 exchange, the total of the two. So if the net ecosystem CO2 exchange is negative, then the site can be considered a carbon sink. If it is positive, then it'll be considered a source. So they found that while warm soiled woody regions were generally carbon sources, the cold soil woody regions were by far the largest form of carbon sinks that they tested for. This is likely due to the larger plant productivity and is able to offset the overall slowed rate of microbial decomposition due to the cold weather. Most vegetation regions at this time were considered carbon sinks. However, with rising air temperatures and more permafrost being thawed, it's likely to change quite soon, if not already. So next we have a meta-analysis by Schur and their team looking to identify multiple studies and their collective analysis of climate change and its effects on thawing permafrost. So this study looks to build a collective framework of data that can be used to create an understanding and a potential solution in the Arctic. Schur and colleagues discussed that even with the overall uncertainty presented from models, that the overall trend from each of them show that carbon emissions from the thawing permafrost is worrying and may only just be starting. So they found that likely by the year 2100, a majority of the carbon emissions terrestrially would have only just begun, and may be in full momentum by that point. However, obviously, models generally bring uncertainty with them. So another topic that they discuss is the potential abundance of abrupt permafrost thaw. So this is in comparison to the generally understood top-down permafrost thaw, where you gradually allow decomposition to occur. This allows for a more sudden thawing and the overall jumpstart of decomposition, and it usually occurs around near lakes and wetlands. So the graph on the right represents the collected data and what the projections from each reference point predicts of the total carbon released by that year. So along with varying results and large uncertainty, it can still be seen that by the year 2100, a significant portion of terrestrial permafrost carbon will have already been released, and with more to come in the future.
So in the first experiment conducted by Natalie and her colleagues, they chose to do a plot-based test over the span of 3 years. They compared different conditions to an ambient control, a warm soil plot, a dry soil plot, and a combination plot. They found that both of these factors play a large role in the total ecosystem respiration that occurs in these regions. As shown in the graph above, the overall change due to warm and dry conditions compared to the ambient tests were quite impactful, since carbon loss was generally much higher. Based on the graph, the 2013 dry bar seems to be much larger than the rest, and this is likely due to the plot's vegetation not incurring as much stress due to the lack of water and continuing on otherwise. This helps to show that while generally plants will uptake carbon worse in drier conditions, this is not always the case, and they are also dependent on the magnitude of the drought. During this experiment, they also test the overall conditions on methane release, and the paper stresses the importance of hydrology on microbial decomposition rates, since ecosystem respiration is generally greatly affected by this factor in the soil. Overall, the study shows that with warming climates, the overall rate of emission is slowly beginning to increase and that it may take effect much sooner than previously thought. In Natalie and her colleagues' second study, they mainly analyzed the total winter emissions produced from microbial decompositions terrestrially. They found that microbial activity was generally permitted to continue longer than usual, and this was due to an abundance of insulation from winter snow cover. This caused them to favor more on-site observational studies, as satellite imagery was not capable of factoring for snow cover depth, so insulation. After studying the total emissions from their regional sites during the winter, they found that the total winter emissions of their studied permafrost region far outweighed the same region's growing season uptake rates. While this does not account for the total yearly uptake in emission, it displays the disparity in growing trend towards terrestrial Arctic carbon sourcing into the environment. In this next study, the focus was on the Arctic Ocean as either a carbon source or a carbon sink. They found that through regional studying, the Arctic Ocean overall acts as a major carbon sink. Again, due to the water's ability as temperature decreases, the solubility of these carbon gases also increases. With the vast amount of area that the Arctic Ocean takes up, it can act as an efficient sink and is likely not to change for many years to come. They also displayed that while most of the carbon uptake is sourced from the atmosphere, the terrestrial carbon from exposed areas near rivers or other runoff sites can find its way into the ocean, continually acting as a sink for multiple sources. One of the most important ways that the Arctic Ocean is able to act as a sink is its ability to shift carbon to other bodies of water, particularly into oceans and seas surrounding the frozen waters. In the graph illustrated, the total observed carbon flux in their studied regions helps to understand the overall movement of carbon in and out of the storage system known as the Arctic Ocean. Overall, it can be summarized that the Arctic Ocean is acting as a carbon storage for the planet and will likely remain one for many more years to come. However, it should be warned that while this comes as a blessing to us, that it may just as easily lose its status sometime in the future.
So there are still many unknowns when considering if the Arctic is a carbon source or a carbon sink, and many studies to be done. Things like the shifting vegetation types in the Arctic. As the shrub line moves north, the overall makeup of the vegetation in the Arctic begins to change. This can increase things like wildfire, change the moisture levels in the ground, which affects permafrost thaw. Also, there are added problems when comparing scientific literature to one another. Obviously, due to things like time constraints and area constraints, it can be difficult to have a standard, but it also becomes difficult to compare these studies. Some literature like Schur in 2015 do a good job of doing it for us, but when you're trying to determine a yearly Arctic carbon budget, it can still be very difficult. Other problems arise when comparing terrestrial studies to ocean studies, as it can be difficult to track the total carbon emitted. This is just generally due to the gray areas between the two studies. So for example, when terrestrial emissions and marine emissions are kept separate, this can be a problem as due to climate change and eroding land, a lot of the terrestrial-based carbon can end up in the ocean. It's also difficult to compare the two studies, as generally the terrestrial studies are more affected by seasonal changes when compared to the ocean studies, and it can just make it very difficult to create a carbon budget.